So thank you for joining us for this parallel session on representing World English pronunciations in the Oxford English Dictionary as part of the Oxford World English Symposium 2022. I'm Catherine Sangster, and my colleague Matthew Morland and I will be talking to you about how we research, develop and refine our World English pronunciation models for the OED. So before we begin, I wanted to share this link. This is where you will find all of the World English pronunciation material that we'll be discussing on the OED's website. We have keys, models, discussions of our decision-making process, and some resources that we hope that people will find useful and instructive when they're thinking about this question. In the discussion that we're going to have now, we really want to highlight the factors that we consider and why it is that making a World English isn't as simple as just taking a research paper or a phonological description of a variety and just adopting it. We're building on the webinar that we gave last year on British and US Englishes, which you can listen to also on the OED's webinar page, but this time with a global focus. Thinking about our World Englishes and issues such as whose pronunciations are we representing? How can we have a meaningful model that reflects all the salient features but is practically useful for users of a dictionary? And how, by having audio alongside our written transcriptions, that makes the transcriptions necessary, but it also allows us to present some narrower detail. We'll go into how we decide on the breadth of a variety from a pronunciation perspective. Why do we, for instance, have Caribbean pronunciations under one umbrella? Why do we group Singapore and Malaysian Englishes together? What's the argument behind avoiding too much proliferation? And again, it comes back often to what is lexicographically useful. We'll talk about coming up with meaningful names for our models and how we remain open to future change when we're doing this work. OED's existing framework when we started treating British and US English as two separate models was a good place for us to jump off. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are at present, and then I'm going to hand over to Matthew to talk about some of the detail after that. The Oxford English Dictionary gives British and American English pronunciations for all words that aren't obsolete. And in 2015, we started supplying words originating in other parts of the English-speaking world with pronunciations in the relevant variety of English too. So for each of those varieties, we have now developed a transcription model which reflects its distinctive sounds, contrasts, and patterns. There were two different ways we had to handle this because some varieties did already have some coverage in OED, like Scottish English or Canadian English. And in those cases, we looked at what was there, we made sure we were happy with it, we regularized it and expanded it to cover a wider number of entries. And other World Englishes were entirely new to OED coverage. For those, we needed to create new models for transcription and do some more research. It was a challenge for us to come up with an effective single model for World Englishes that span populations which are geographically and sociologically diverse. And we have, of course, had to make compromises in the process. We intend our models in every case to reflect the most common features of the forms spoken by the majority of speakers of the variety, rather than trying to demonstrate the full breadth of variation. And again, that just comes back to what is lexicographically useful? What do users of a dictionary find helpful in these cases? And Matthew's going to talk a bit more about the detail of that. And we base all of these decisions on recent phonetic research. Here is the list of all of the World Englishes that we currently cover. So Australian English, Bermudian English, Canadian English, Caribbean English, East African English, Hong Kong English, Irish English, Manx English, New Zealand English, Philippine English, Scottish English, Singapore and Malaysian English, South African English, Welsh English, and West African English. And these, you can see the keys and the models for each of these varieties at the link that I shared at the start of the talk. So we've talked about building the transcription models, but the other part of our pronunciation offering is that alongside each of the transcriptions, we supply a recording of the word. And these recordings are created by speakers who are actual speakers of the relevant variety. And this gives our users the opportunity to hear the pronunciation spoken aloud, whether IPA is less accessible or whether just hearing it alongside the IPA gives a more detailed illustration. We're very proud of the audio that we produce and that we make available alongside. I'm going to hand over to Matthew now to go into some of the detail.
Thank you, Catherine. So as we get into this process, let's just take a quick snapshot of where we were recently. This is from March the 7th and the numbers of pronunciations we had for each variety. Notice we're talking here the number of individual pronunciations, not the number of entries, which would be smaller as several of these varieties may have multiple pronunciations in some of the entries. So these are from the models that we've published, as Catherine says, and as I say, at a first glance comparison, you can see how the phrase happy birthday might be rendered in each of those varieties. And this is purely as predictions of each model. But what you can see from the numbers is that Scottish English produces the most sizable group in our current offering by a considerable margin. But Australian, New Zealand, South African and Irish Englishes have around about 1,000 apiece. The Irish English, compared to these numbers, will have grown quite considerably since then, as that week we added about 100 more into that, and we're constantly adding more for each variety as we go. At the other end of the spectrum, there are far fewer of the Hong Kong English, Singaporean, Malaysian and Bermudian pronunciations at the moment, but we always have scope for more. So let's think a bit about that process that Catherine mentioned. Within the remit that Catherine described and operating within the space afforded by our existing British and US models, we can look at the process that we have for devising pronunciation models for each of the additional varieties we have. We're going to start by summarizing the general process, and then in a couple of slides' time, I'm going to explore the principles that guide us at each step. So we begin with a brief from the lexicographers within the OED. And there's often some initial scoping to determine whether there is a single pronunciation model that is feasible for that population. And so we also bear in mind that we're rarely reflecting the most prestigious, most educated or acrolectal forms. We're looking much more general, intermediate levels, mesolectal forms that are more representative of the population speakers at large. And from that, we as phoneticians identify the reputable sources that will feed into the first draft of that model. Now, typically, we're looking for phonological descriptions in the academic literature, but certainly not exclusively. Existing dictionaries will play a part here. So the New Zealand Oxford Dictionary or the Dictionary of South African English. Notes from specialist consultants will play a part here as well. And depending on the variety, we may be turning to websites written by academics or governments or other recognized organizations with a language remit. Some very niche journal articles will help inform specific aspects of the varieties. And in some cases, we also look at the phonologies of other languages spoken by the target population. Now, the next step happens in slightly different orders depending on the variety. So we essentially need a phonological description that encompasses both the phonological system and the phonological structure. So for the system, we're looking for clarity as to the meaningful contrasts of that variety, i.e. the phonemes, and we're also looking for the core variants of each phoneme, the allophones. And for the structure, we need to understand the permitted combinations of these sounds within syllables and within words, along with any positional or contextual limitations. Effectively, we're talking about that variety's phonotactics. Now, for some varieties, the consonants are by far the easiest place to start, especially if they share much of their phonology their consonantal inventory with British or American US Englishes. Australian English, for example, is a non-rhotic variety with a variable flapping of intervocalic T. So it means that some speakers will sound more similar to British speakers and others will sound more similar to American English speakers on a word such as beauty. And for this, you can hear these two examples.
Beauty. Beauty.
Now, for other varieties, we will begin with our vowel keywords, which are the lexical sets of John Wells with a handful of additions. Now, we explore the phonetic qualities that are used for each of those vowels and what contrasts exist, what vowel reduction exists, if any, and what sort of direction there is with any trends within the speakers of that population. Our very first port of call for most of our varieties has been the descriptions of the 4-volume Varieties of English, which use many of those same keywords in their descriptions by variety specialists. Now, the final part of this stage for each of our varieties is to review the prosodic patterns that are relevant. So we're interested here in any regularity of stress patterning. We're interested in whether the variety edges towards syllable timing. And in such cases, and we're talking here about Philippine English, Singaporean Malaysian English, Hong Kong English, the stress contrasts are less salient than in some of the other varieties. So this flattened stress distinction is shown by most syllables having at least a secondary stress. And you can hear this when we compare British and Singaporean Malaysian Englishes in this entry.
Lepaking.
Lepaking.
We also want to highlight examples such as in Caribbean English, where the syllable pitch is different from the syllable stress. And addressing this in our phonological models enables us to contextualize why some of the audio may otherwise sound at odds with the stress placement to speakers of other varieties. Also at this stage, we're thinking about notes on connected speech, so things like linking R or assimilation, and that'll all feed in at this point. And this cycle is repeated with some greater or lesser formality for any variety where we're looking to encompass multiple populations under a single umbrella, such as with Singapore and Malaysian Englishes, which were explored separately, and then a proposal drawn up that best reflected the two together. And the most complex so far has been with Caribbean English. Now, we factored in the descriptions of Jamaican English, Jamaican Creole, Trinidadian and Tobagan Englishes, Bahamian English, and Bajan, and several others. Within this stage, we also go to consultants, if appropriate, which we did with East African English to get their advice on which areas to focus on. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what guides our resolution phase in an upcoming slide. But ultimately, what we come to through our exploration of the phonological descriptions is a draft that makes sense for what we're attempting to achieve. And we draft the first round of entries that are going to be transcribed using the new model, and we flag up any gaps that the model is unable to predict with certainty, or which our sources and our natural language evidence fail to resolve. Our audio recording process is then an invaluable step where our model comes to life. So these are real native speakers, as Catherine mentioned. They are not synthesized voices. And it's feedback from those speakers that feeds into a final review of the model before it's published. Now, for some varieties where we have major sources using different transcription schemes, we will work up any grids to assist with the transliteration of one system to another. And we currently have this for the Dictionary of Hiberno English and the Dictionary of South African English, but we also have some fairly routine conversions when we import from a number of other dictionaries and sources. Also included here are where we've got considerations from where we may have rather little concerning the English, but we might have a guide from a root language. So there are some likely conversions from Maori words or Swahili words. So we consider how these will map across in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. But from all of that, we get our working model. And I emphasize here, it's a working document. It's subject to ongoing review. And we're going to look in a little while at some of the ongoing revisions that are currently happening. But what we ultimately publish is this, the Key to Pronunciation, which is essentially the quick reference guide to what symbols are used in that variety. I've cut some of the blurb at the top here, just so you can see how it roughly looks. And then the model itself, again, where you can see there's a bit of a description. It's a bit longer than that. And then an explanation of kind of the vowel keywords and a bit more explanation beneath. So let's turn our attention then to what guides the resolution phase. What guides our resolution to these new pronunciation models? Well, any model has to meet 3 requirements fundamentally. The first thing it has to be is meaningful. It has to capture all the core phonemic contrasts of that variety and also the characteristic qualities. So in words such as goat, some varieties, such as British and US Englishes, have diphthongal vowels. So that's where the quality changes during the vowel. Others have monophthongal vowels where there isn't such a perceptible quality change, as in Caribbean or Scottish, Welsh, East and West African Englishes. So when we listen for that final vowel in the word gambo, which our British English audio has as
Gambo.
British English has a diphthong, but the Welsh English version has a monophthong.
Gambo.
Now in Welsh English, we wouldn't lose a contrast to represent that final vowel with the same symbol as in British English, but it would mask a really salient difference between the 2 qualities. And this relates to how the models are not predominantly drafted to stand alone, but they're drafted to be used in conjunction with and highlighting the differences between the varieties. Flapping of T is another area that's not strictly phonemic, but is where the models routinely reflect such a feature because it's a salient characteristic quality. Now, the second point, alongside being meaningful, is that the model has to be firmly grounded. It has to be faithful to the variety it's representing. For most varieties, the descriptions we consult will clash at some point, and we have to adopt a position. So in a few cases, as with Canadian English, that position is to optimize consistency with some of the other OUP resources, such as the Canadian Oxford Dictionary. In other cases, the drive for this to be an accurate representation of multiple population groups will mean selecting 1 or 2 pronunciations over others. Now, we adopt a descriptivist stance here, so we're not prescribing a correct form, and this usually results in prioritizing the majority pronunciation. In Caribbean English, this means that clashes are generally skewed in their resolution towards Jamaican English. In West African English towards Nigerian and Ghanaian Englishes. But there's scope deliberately retained in the models for entries from specific areas within a variety to be tailored in that direction. So, for example, special patterns apply if the West African English model has a word that requires a transcription of a Hausa origin. And we're also careful to offer variants in models where to settle on one option would mean that one of the populations would be unduly misrepresented. It is important, though, to recognise how each transcription is recognised as an abstraction. It's a broad map of the pronunciation territory that is inevitably complex, and it will always have allophonic detail or contextual or individual variation that would be too narrow to be useful if we were to show it. Each audio file is purely an example, if you like, it's a snapshot of the terrain represented by the map. but it will have detail that's specific to that speaker at that moment in time. And this brings us to our third criterion, the usability criterion. We could have supremely specified transcriptions that encapsulate every bit of variation to a huge level of detail, but that wouldn't be of any use to anyone. Too much detail means that users can't tune into the salient qualities and understand the core contrasts that they're listening for and need to make. So the model needs some form of consistency, a predictability about it. And part of making it usable is to ensure that we use as few symbols as possible across the varieties to cover all of the contrasts. And the symbols themselves should be as familiar as possible to users. So for this reason, we borrow heavily from the International Phonetic Alphabet when we're expanding from our core set of symbols. Part of the usability criterion is also about minimizing variance, because it's just not useful if there are 6 or 7 variants at every single entry. So models will have to limit their scope in places. Inevitably, there are going to be grey areas caused by abstract segmental phonemic transcription. Vowel areas in South African English, for example, have contextual reasons why some of those areas are particularly overlapping. And some of the speaker differences also can't be suitably captured. So a speaker's sensitivity towards a given root language will result in different pronunciations, whether that's different approaches to Maori loans in New Zealand English, or to Afrikaans loans in South African English, or to Scots loans in Scottish English. But crucially, OED does not aim to provide transcriptions of speakers who code switch. In this particular entry, for example,
Sue May.
We're listening for those minimal anglicizations from those Hong Kong English speakers who are assimilating it into their English speech, not giving the pronunciations of those who switch into Cantonese when they produce this word. And this does bring us skirting around the edge of whose pronunciations we're actually reflecting. For a long time, we've documented that we are reflecting the speech of educated urban speakers of standard English, but we're recognizing now how there is increasingly cultural, geographic, and ethnic diversity within this population. And while we're typically steering away from acrolectal or more prestigious forms of a variety, where there might be greater similarities with British or US Englishes, neither are we looking at the other end of the scale, where mutual intelligibility would be lost with speakers of other English varieties. Instead, what we're aiming for is an intermediate level, where there is feasibly some mutual intelligibility across varieties, but where the distinctiveness of each population's speech is still captured. Moving on to our vowel symbols. I'll talk very briefly about this. We're going to use a vowel quadrilateral to explore this. This is to plot their approximate qualities. For those unfamiliar with vowel quadrilaterals, vowels that are indicated at the top of the quadrilateral are produced with part of the tongue close to the top of the mouth. Those at the bottom are more open. Those on the left of the quadrilateral are made with the focus on the front of the tongue body. That's the part of your tongue used to make the y in yes. And those on the right are made with the focus on the back of the tongue body. That's the part used to make the k in car. Red symbols are those produced with rounded lips. Those which are blue are those with neutral or spread lips. And this chart shows the vowel symbols used across our British and American systems, and together they offer quite a lot of scope to play with when it comes to the models for our world Englishes. And this is especially the case when you consider how we can take diphthong symbols, like the symbol used for A, and can split that apart and use the individual parts without having to expand the core symbol set per se. We can also choose how we use length marks, because there's differences already in how British and American use those. So with the World English models, you can see that there are only a handful of additions. The first relates to the vowels in words such as nurse. Whilst OED's British English system regards this as the same vowel as in at the end of letter, and uses the turned E, the schwa, but with length marks in nurse, some of the literature on some of the varieties, such as Hong Kong, Australian, New Zealand, and South African Englishes, instead makes a quality distinction that warrants a subtly different central vowel. I should say it's not used entirely reliably, and on the IPA chart is actually reflecting a slightly more open quality than is often used here. But this does then indicate that it means a word like British English Berg, for which our British sound file is this,
Berg,
can sound slightly different and be represented as slightly different from the South African
Berg.
The other three additions to the chart versus the previous one you saw are the rounded vowels. So one of these is a rounded central vowel of roughly mid-height, and another is a rounded central vowel of close height. And both of these are to capture salient features of Bermudian English. And unfortunately, we don't yet have the audio to demonstrate this for you today. But I can demonstrate the third addition. And the third one is effectively a rounded quality. And this is the quality of the vowel in nurse in Welsh English. And it means that when we have the horse breed called Merlin, it means that the Welsh English sounds like this.
Merlin.
There are a couple of other points to note here as well. In the phonetic and phonological literature, the turned V symbol that can be used in different ways. And it often reflects a fairly central, open quality, as in its common use in British English phonemic transcription. But in some of the varieties of English, that symbol reflects a quality that's more towards the back of the vowel space, nearer its IPA quality. So we use this more broadly. And new diphthongs can also be formed from the symbols we've got. So it means that in Australian and New Zealand Englishes, we can represent how the first vowel in the word placer can be represented as more open a diphthong compared with British English.
Placer.
Placer.
We can also represent how the O diphthong is different from both British English and from each other amongst the Australian and New Zealand Englishes. So it means that from British Burko, we have the Australian and New Zealand
Burko,
Burko.
Compared with that, consonants are far less varied. OED has long given scope for the voiceless velar fricative, even within British and American, on words such as
Loch,
Lach.
So there were no new symbols needed when Scottish English required it for that same word.
Loch,
And similarly, we could use it then when Irish, Manx, Welsh, South African and Canadian Englishes all needed it for other words. Similarly, the British English model has retained scope for the voiceless alveolar lateral fricative, and that was always the case for words of Welsh origin that we had it available. So it means that for this particular word,
Pennill,
we had no difficulties when Welsh English then wanted to represent the same quality.
Pennill.
And similarly, that symbol was ready for adoption by South African English when words such as llchutla, even though we are aware that in other varieties, that lateral frication is likely to be dropped. Most consonantal differences between varieties are distributional rather than systemic, though, allowing for certain sounds in certain positions but not others. Some varieties have fewer contrasts, though, than British or US Englishes because of how they pronounce words in which British or US English speakers would have a th or a th, the dental fricatives, or a zh sound. Not all varieties use those particular qualities. But Welsh English also has an interesting feature here of where length marks are used on consonants to represent gemination or doubling. So it means that the English pronunciations of patrin will be for British patrin, but for the Welsh English sound more like
Patrin.
the only consonantal addition over British and US English qualities so far has been the recent inclusion of a symbol to represent a complex merger between v and w in Bermudian English. And we're awaiting our audio of this, but the form of well, that means an adjective meaning tasty, is pronounced in Bermudian English as val or vel. So we've done quite a lot already without needing to introduce a raft of brand new symbols. And it means that we've been able to represent 7 pronunciations of a word such as avail and see the key differences between those. But having said that, in our current work on Indian English, there are some more consonant symbols to come. With that, I'm going to hand over to Catherine to talk a bit more about some of those upcoming and ongoing changes.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for that detailed walkthrough of all of our processes and principles and policies for how we are representing World Englishes in OED. And yes, as Matthew just trailed, we have some future plans. So I want to conclude by just saying a little about what we plan to do next, sharing a way that you can make your own contributions, and then we will finish. So we are, as Matthew says, working on Indian English. We have in fact been working on Indian English for a very long time. It's been particularly challenging for many different reasons. It exists in a multilingual context. You have a wide variety of different influences on Indian English's pronunciation, depending on the large number of possible other languages spoken by speakers of Indian English, the L1s there. Also by the status of English in education systems in India, and just simply the scale. It is such a very large number of speakers of Indian English. We want to be sure that we are doing justice to it by building a model that really reflects it, makes sense of it, but also meets those 3 principles that Matthew talked about earlier. We're also starting to work on varieties of English that belong to speech communities that we are defining not by their geographical location, but by ethnic group. We'll be beginning this work with our exploration of how African American English works, and how developing a model and transcriptions and audio in the same way for our future African American English coverage. And we're also doing a set of models for various Hispanic American Englishes, starting with Mexican American English as well. But besides the new directions and the new models and the expansion and adding to that list you saw at the start, we're also always revising the models we have. We always want to keep them live. We want to keep them open to looking at new research, getting feedback from people, and just being able to keep them as good as they possibly can be, which means keeping them flexible and keeping them changeable. We recently made some revisions to our Irish English model following some consultation, and our New Zealand English model, which we're looking at the moment. It already exists, and it already accounts for variation between the New Zealand English of Maori speakers and non-Maori speakers, but we're looking further into that, and we're making some further refinements. So I wanted to finish by directing your attention to the ability of anybody making a submission to OED to include audio in that submission. So if you are making a suggestion at this, the URL that you see here, for a new word or for a change to an existing word, you can, as well as writing your thoughts about the word, and there is space for you to write a transcription if you so wish, but if you want to add a sound file, all you have to do is create one yourself by whatever means available to you, and drop it in there, and then we will actually be able to hear your voice saying the word that you would like us to consider. And that is such a wonderful way for us to hear all these Englishes in use. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attention. Please do send any questions concerning this presentation to the address you see on the screen. And thank you to Danica and the organisers of the symposium for inviting us to take part.